Throughout history, there have been whispers of something that challenges everything we think we know about what makes us human. Stories of children found in the wilderness, living not among their own kind, but with creatures of fur and fang. These are not fairy tales or legends passed down through generations. These are real stories, documented cases that force us to confront uncomfortable questions about nature, nurture, and the very essence of humanity itself. In the forests of 18th century France, a boy emerged from the wilderness unable to speak, walking on all fours, his body covered in scars. In the jungles of India, hunters discovered children living in wolf dens, howling at the moon and eating raw meat. In modern Russia, police found a young boy who had made himself leader of a pack of stray dogs, surviving the brutal Moscow winters by sleeping among them. And in Ukraine, a little girl spent 5 formative years of her life in a dog kennel, learning to bark and walk on all fours because her alcoholic parents had locked her outside and never looked for her. These are the stories of feral children, and they are more haunting than any fiction could ever be. What happens when a human child is raised without human contact? What parts of our humanity are innate, and what parts must be learned? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does it say about us as a species that in some cases, animals prove to be more nurturing parents than the humans who should have cared for these children? The phenomenon is extraordinarily rare. Throughout all of recorded human history, there have been only about 100 documented cases. But each one opens a window into questions that philosophers and scientists have grappled with for centuries. Today we're going to explore some of the most compelling and well-documented cases of children who were raised by animals. These are not adventure stories. They are tragic tales of abandonment, survival, and the profound impact that early childhood has on human development. But they are also stories of resilience, of the mysterious bonds that can form between species, and of the sometimes surprising capacity for recovery. Let us begin at the very dawn of the 19th century, in the woods of southern France, where a boy would emerge from the wilderness and change our understanding of human nature forever. It was a harsh winter in the year 1800 when residents of a small village in Aveyron, France, began reporting sightings of something strange in the woods. At first, the accounts were dismissed as tricks of the light, or perhaps a large animal moving through the underbrush. But the reports persisted, and they all told the same unsettling story. There was a child out there, a young boy, completely naked despite the freezing temperatures, moving through the forest with an almost animal-like grace. He would dart away at the slightest hint of human approach, disappearing into the dense foliage as if he had never been there at all. For years, the villagers had caught glimpses of this mysterious figure. Sometimes he would venture close to the edges of farms, stealing vegetables from gardens or roots from the earth. But whenever anyone tried to approach, he would flee with astonishing speed. His existence became something of a local legend, a puzzle that no one could quite solve. Who was this boy? Where had he come from? And most importantly, how had he survived alone in the wilderness? The winter of 1797 brought the first serious attempt to capture the boy. A group of hunters, more persistent than most, tracked him through the forest until they managed to corner him near a tree. When the boy attempted to climb to safety, they seized their opportunity and grabbed him. But their victory was short-lived. The boy was taken to a nearby village where a kind widow took him in, hoping to care for him and help him readjust to human society. She gave him food, a warm bed, and attempted to clothe him. But the child was inconsolable. He refused to wear the clothes she provided, tearing them off as soon as they were put on him. He would eat only raw vegetables or those he could cook himself over an open flame. Most tellingly, he seemed utterly terrified of being confined indoors. After just 1 week in the widow's care, he managed to escape, disappearing back into the forest he called home. For the next 2 years, the boy was periodically spotted in the woods, always fleeing from human contact, always returning to the wild. But something changed in January of 1800. Perhaps the winter was too harsh even for someone accustomed to the elements. Perhaps he was growing weary of his solitary existence. Or perhaps, at some level, there remained a dim memory of a different life, one lived among other human beings. Whatever the reason, on January 8, 1800, the boy walked out of the forest and into a dyer's workshop in the village of Saint-Cernin-sur-Rance. He had, in the words of historian Harlan Lane, slipped across the threshold into a new life and into a new era in the education of mankind. The boy was taken to an orphanage, and from there, his case quickly attracted the attention of the scientific community. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a time when philosophers and scientists were deeply engaged in debates about human nature. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had popularized the concept of the noble savage, the idea that humans in their natural state, uncorrupted by society, would be gentle, innocent, and essentially good. Many intellectuals believed that by studying this wild child, they could finally answer fundamental questions about what makes us human. Was civilization something imposed upon us, or was it an essential part of our nature? When the boy arrived in Paris, he became an instant sensation. People of all social classes flocked to see him, eager to witness this living embodiment of Rousseau's theories. But what they saw was far from the noble savage of philosophical imagination. The boy was estimated to be around 12 years old, though his exact age was impossible to determine. He was unable to speak, communicating only through grunts and other inarticulate sounds. He walked on all fours more comfortably than he walked upright. His body was covered in scars, some clearly the result of falls or encounters with wild animals, others more disturbing, including a prominent scar across his throat that suggested someone had once tried to cut it. The boy's behavior was more animal than human. He would sniff food before eating it, much like a dog. When given hot potatoes, he would pluck them directly from boiling water without any sign of discomfort, his hands apparently having lost much of their sensitivity to heat. He showed no interest in human interaction and no response to most sounds, leading some observers to initially believe he was deaf. However, he would respond immediately to sounds that held meaning for him, such as the cracking of a walnut shell or the rustle of someone preparing food. He preferred to be naked and would attempt to remove any clothing put on him. When allowed outside in winter, he would frolic in the snow without any apparent discomfort, his body having adapted to endure exposure in ways that seemed almost superhuman. A prominent physician named Philippe Pinel was called in to examine the boy. Pinel was one of the foremost experts on mental illness and intellectual disability of his time. After his examination, he delivered a disappointing verdict. The boy, he declared, was not a wild child at all, but simply an incurable idiot, someone born with severe intellectual disabilities. Pinel argued that the boy's family had likely abandoned him in the forest because of these disabilities, perhaps only months or at most a year or two before he was found. The scars, the inability to speak, the apparent lack of cognitive function, all of it pointed to a child who had been mentally impaired from birth, not one who had been shaped by years in the wilderness. Most of the scientific community accepted Pinel's assessment, and the boy was consigned to wander the grounds of the Institute for Deaf Mutes, where he had been placed, with no real attempt at education or rehabilitation. His case seemed closed, another sad story of a mentally disabled child who had been cruelly abandoned by his family. But one young physician could not accept this conclusion. His name was Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, and he was only 25 years old when he first encountered the wild boy. But what Itard lacked in age and experience, he made up for in determination and an unshakable belief in the power of education. Itard looked at the boy and saw not an idiot, but a blank slate, a human being who had simply never been given the opportunity to learn. He disagreed fundamentally with Pinel's assessment. How could a mentally disabled person have survived alone in the wild for years? Such a feat would require intelligence, adaptability, and sophisticated problem-solving skills. No, Itard believed the boy's condition was not the result of inherent disability, but of extreme deprivation. He had been denied human contact during the most critical years of development, and as a result, he had never learned the things that most humans take for granted: language, social behavior, even the ability to walk upright with ease. Itard named the boy Victor, the first real identity he had ever been given, and set about developing an ambitious program to civilize him. He believed that if he could provide Victor with the right kind of structured education, he could reverse the effects of his years in the wild and unlock the human potential that Itard was convinced lay dormant within him. The program Itard developed was revolutionary for its time, incorporating what we would now call sensory therapy, behavior modification, and speech therapy. He would work with Victor for 5 years, documenting every aspect of his efforts in meticulous detail. Itard's approach was methodical and comprehensive. He began with the most basic tasks, trying to awaken Victor's dulled senses and expand his capacity to experience the world. He exposed Victor to different temperatures, textures, and sensations, trying to make him more responsive to his environment. He worked on simple tasks, like teaching Victor to understand the connection between objects and their uses. He tried, again and again, to teach Victor to speak, to form words, to communicate in the way that came so naturally to other human beings. There were moments of genuine progress that gave Itard hope. Victor learned to recognize his own name. He could identify certain written words and match them to objects. He developed a crude system of communication using wooden letters, spelling out simple requests like milk or walk. He learned to wear clothes, though he never seemed entirely comfortable in them. He could eat with utensils, sleep in a bed, and perform simple household tasks. Most remarkably, he seemed to develop genuine affection for Itard's housekeeper, Madame Guérin, who cared for him with maternal warmth. When she was sad, mourning the death of her husband, Victor made clumsy but sincere attempts to comfort her, showing that he was capable of empathy and emotional connection. But in other crucial ways, Victor remained locked away from full humanity. Despite 5 years of intensive training, he never learned to speak. The most he could manage were a few simple sounds, nothing approaching actual language. His responses to social situations remained awkward and often inappropriate. He showed little interest in other people beyond the small circle of those who cared for him, and perhaps most tellingly, the call of the wild never completely left him. He would spend hours staring out windows at the natural world beyond. When Itard took him on a trip to a wooded valley outside Paris, hoping to please him, Victor became so agitated and made so many attempts to escape that Itard decided such outings were too dangerous to continue. After 5 years, Itard acknowledged that his experiment had failed. He had hoped to transform Victor into a fully functioning member of society, to prove that education could overcome even the most extreme deprivation. Instead, he had managed only to teach Victor the basics of civilized life, enough to survive in human society, but not enough to truly thrive. Victor would never be able to speak fluently, to read complex texts, to form meaningful relationships beyond his small circle of caregivers. In his final report, Itard wrote with evident disappointment about what he saw as his failures, though he took some consolation in the progress, however limited, that Victor had made. Victor remained in the care of Madame Guérin for the rest of his life. The French government provided a small annual pension for his upkeep, acknowledging their responsibility for this strange ward of the state. He lived quietly, largely forgotten by the scientific community that had once found him so fascinating. In 1828, at approximately 40 years of age, Victor died of pneumonia. He was buried in a cemetery in Paris, his grave unmarked and soon forgotten. But Victor's legacy lived on in ways that neither he nor Itard could have imagined. The methods Itard developed while working with Victor, his careful attention to sensory development, his structured approach to education, his belief that even the most impaired individuals could learn and grow, all of these would profoundly influence the field of special education. Itard went on to become a pioneer in educating deaf and developmentally disabled children, and his work laid the foundation for modern special education practices. The techniques he first tested on the Wild Boy of Aveyron are still, in modified form, used today. Moreover, Victor's case became a landmark in our understanding of human development. It provided strong evidence for what psychologists now call critical periods, windows of time during which certain types of learning must occur, or they may become impossible later in life. Victor's inability to learn language despite years of instruction suggested that there was a specific period in early childhood when language acquisition must take place. Miss that window, and the ability may be lost forever. This insight has had profound implications for our understanding of child development and has influenced everything from education policy to our understanding of neglect and abuse. But perhaps most importantly, Victor forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about what it means to be human. He was not the noble savage of Enlightenment fantasy, living in harmony with nature and possessed of an innate goodness. But neither was he simply an animal, despite his years in the wild. He was something in between, a human being shaped by circumstances so extreme that they pushed him to the very edges of humanity. His story raised questions that we still grapple with today. How much of who we are is determined by biology, and how much by our environment and experiences? Can the damage of extreme early deprivation ever be fully healed? And what responsibility does society have to those who fall through the cracks, to the children who are abandoned, neglected, or simply lost? In the end, Victor of Aveyron remains one of the most famous and most thoroughly documented cases of a feral child in history. But he was far from the only one. And as we move forward in time and cross the globe to 19th century India, we will encounter another boy whose story would capture the world's imagination and perhaps inspire one of the most beloved adventure stories ever written. The year was 1867, and the British Raj ruled over India with an iron fist. It was a time of great upheaval, of cultures colliding and traditional ways of life being disrupted by colonial powers. In the district of Bulandshahr in Uttar Pradesh, a group of hunters tracked a wolf through the dense jungle, following the creature as it led them deeper into the wilderness. The wolf seemed to be heading toward a specific destination, and the hunters, curious now rather than simply hungry for the hunt, followed at a careful distance. The wolf led them to a cave, a dark opening in the rocky hillside that promised shelter from the elements and privacy from prying human eyes. The hunters crept closer, peering into the darkness, trying to discern what lay within. What they saw made them freeze in astonishment and perhaps a touch of fear. There, in the gloom of the cave, huddled among a pack of wolves, was a human child. A boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old by their estimation, completely naked, crouched on all fours among the animals as if he belonged there. The hunters called out to the boy, trying to coax him out of the cave, trying to communicate with him in Hindi and the local dialect. But the boy did not respond to their words. He did not appear to understand that they were even trying to speak to him. Instead, he and the wolves retreated deeper into the cave, the pack forming a protective circle around their unusual member. The hunters were faced with a dilemma. They could not simply leave a human child living with wild animals. But how could they extract him from the cave without endangering themselves or the boy? In the end, they made a decision that seems harsh by modern standards, but was perhaps unavoidable given the circumstances. They set fire to brush at the cave's entrance, creating smoke that would drive the wolves out. As the smoke began to fill the cave, the wolves had no choice but to emerge, the boy among them. The hunters shot several of the wolves, and in the chaos and confusion, they were able to seize the boy and carry him away from the only home he had ever known, or at least the only one he could remember. The boy was taken to the local district magistrate, who examined this strange find with a mixture of fascination and horror. The child walked on all fours with a practiced ease that suggested he had been doing so for years. When offered food, he would sniff it suspiciously before eating, and he showed a strong preference for raw meat over anything cooked. He made no sounds that resembled human speech, communicating instead through growls and other noises that seemed more lupine than human. He had thick calluses on his palms and knees from walking on all fours, and his body bore numerous scars, presumably from his life in the wild. The magistrate decided the boy should be sent to the Secondra Mission Orphanage in the city of Agra, where missionaries might be able to care for him and hopefully rehabilitate him to some degree. The orphanage was run by a Christian mission, and the reverend in charge, a man named Father Earhart, took charge of the strange new arrival. Because the boy had no name, or at least no name he could communicate, and because no one knew when he had been born, they gave him the name Sanichar. It was an Urdu word meaning Saturday, the day of the week on which he had arrived at the orphanage. They gave him the first name Dina, and so he became Dina Sanichar, the wolf boy of Secondra. The missionaries at the orphanage did their best to care for Dina, but they quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond their experience. The boy was not like other children, not even like other troubled or traumatized children they had cared for. He seemed in many ways more wolf than human, as if the years spent with the pack had fundamentally altered something essential in his nature. Father Earhart noted in his journals that while he considered Dina to be mentally impaired, he also observed signs of intelligence and even creativity. The boy could solve problems, could learn basic tasks, and showed a kind of cunning that suggested a sharp mind at work, even if it was a mind that operated in ways very different from most humans. But teaching Dina to be human proved extraordinarily difficult. He resisted wearing clothes, tearing them off whenever possible, only gradually and reluctantly accepting that he would be required to cover himself in the company of others. He initially refused to eat cooked food, accepting only raw meat, and it took months of patient coaxing before he would even try anything that had been prepared over a fire. Even when he did begin to eat cooked food, he maintained the habit of gnawing on bones for hours, using them to sharpen his teeth, a behavior he had presumably learned from the wolves. The most persistent challenge was language. The missionaries tried everything they could think of to teach Dina to speak. They spoke to him constantly, hoping he would begin to mimic their sounds. They tried to teach him using sign language, pointing at objects and making gestures. But Dina could not or would not learn to point, a gesture that seems so simple and natural to humans, but which wolves never use because they have no fingers. His communication remained limited to the sounds he had learned from the wolves, growls and howls and other vocalizations that the missionaries found disturbing and incomprehensible. However, Dina did make some progress in adapting to human life. Over time, he learned to walk upright, though he never seemed entirely comfortable doing so, and would often revert to all fours when he was tired or stressed. He learned to use a toilet, to eat from a plate, to perform simple tasks around the orphanage. He even learned to wear shoes, though this seemed to cause him particular distress at first. Most remarkably, he formed a bond with another feral child who was brought to the orphanage sometime after his arrival, another boy who had also been found living with wolves. Father Earhart noted that the two boys had a strange bond of sympathy for one another. They would spend hours together, and Dina even managed to teach the other boy how to drink from a cup, demonstrating a capacity for patience and instruction that suggested his intelligence was greater than many observers believed. But despite these small victories, Dina Sanichar would never truly become part of human society. He remained profoundly isolated, unable to form meaningful connections with most of the people around him. He lived at the Sikandra Mission Orphanage for over 20 years, a curiosity to visitors and a puzzle to the missionaries who cared for him. During his time at the orphanage, he developed one habit that would prove tragically prophetic. At some point, someone gave him a cigarette, or perhaps he stole one, and he discovered he enjoyed smoking. It became one of his few pleasures, and he became a heavy smoker, often seen sitting by himself, puffing away at a cigarette, lost in thoughts that no one could access. In 1895, at approximately 34 or 35 years of age, Dina Sanichar died of tuberculosis. His lungs, damaged by years of heavy smoking and perhaps also by his early exposure to the elements, had finally given out. He was buried at the orphanage, and his grave was marked with a simple stone. The Wolf Boy's story seemed to be at an end, one more sad tale of a child who slipped through the cracks, who experienced something so unusual that he never fully recovered from it. But Dina Sanichar's story did not end with his death. Because around the time Dina was living out his final years at the orphanage, a young British man named Rudyard Kipling was growing up in India. Kipling had been born in Mumbai in 1865, just 2 years before Dina was discovered in the caves of Uttar Pradesh. He spent the first years of his life in India before being sent to England for his education. But he returned to India as a young man and spent years there working as a journalist and beginning his career as a writer. India in the late 19th century was full of stories about feral children. Dina Sanichar wasn't the only wolf child to be discovered during this period. British officials and local authorities recorded at least 5 other cases of children reportedly found living with wolves or other wild animals. These stories captured the public imagination, representing a fascinating collision between the civilized world of British colonial rule and the wild, untamed nature of the Indian subcontinent. They became the stuff of legend and speculation, discussed in drawing rooms and written about in newspapers. Kipling was fascinated by India, by its cultures and its wildlife and its mysteries. His father, John Lockwood Kipling, was an artist and scholar who had written a book called Beast and Man in India, published in 1891, which specifically mentioned the wolf-child stories that were circulating at the time. The younger Kipling drew on a wide range of sources and inspirations for his work, and in 1894, he published The Jungle Book, a collection of stories that would become one of the most famous works of children's literature ever written. The Jungle Book tells the story of Mowgli, the man-cub, a human boy who is raised by wolves in the Indian jungle. He learns the ways of the jungle from his wolf mother, from the wise panther Bagheera, from the jovial bear Baloo. He faces danger from the tiger Shere Khan, but ultimately finds a place for himself, accepted by neither the human world nor the animal world, but finding his own path between them. It is a story of adventure and coming of age, of learning to navigate between different worlds and different ways of being. While Kipling never explicitly stated that Mowgli was based on any particular real child, the similarities between his fictional creation and boys like Dina Sanichar are impossible to ignore. Kipling was writing The Jungle Book around the same time that Dina's story was well known in India. He would certainly have heard about the wolf boy and other feral children. And while Kipling's version is romanticized, turning what was in reality a tragedy into an adventure story, with a positive message about self-discovery and harmony between humans and nature, the core concept is the same. A human child, separated from his own kind, raised by wild animals, learning their ways and becoming something between human and beast. The difference, of course, is that Mowgli's story has a happy ending. He thrives in the jungle, protected and loved by his animal family. He learns valuable lessons and becomes a hero to both animals and humans. When he finally returns to human society, it is as a figure of strength and wisdom, someone who has gained something valuable from his unusual upbringing. It is an appealing fantasy, the idea that there is something pure and noble about living close to nature, that we might gain wisdom and strength from rejecting the corruptions of civilization. But the reality, as Dina Sanichar's life demonstrated, was nothing like Kipling's fiction. Dina did not become a hero. He did not gain special wisdom from his years with the wolves. Instead, he lost something fundamental, the capacity to be fully human. He spent his entire life struggling with the most basic aspects of human existence, unable to speak, unable to connect with others, forever marked by those early years of deprivation. His story is not one of adventure, but of profound tragedy, of a childhood lost and a life spent in isolation, always on the outside, looking in at a world he could never quite access. Yet the power of Kipling's fiction has ensured that when people think of children raised by wolves, they think first of Mowgli, swinging through the trees and singing with the animals, not of the real wolf boys like Dina Sanichar, alone in an orphanage, howling sounds that no human could understand. The Jungle Book has been adapted countless times into films and television shows and countless other media. It has inspired generations of children to dream of wild adventures and animal companions. But behind that fiction lies a truth that is darker and more complex. A truth embodied in the life and death of a boy who could never quite find his place in the human world. And as we move from 19th century India to the late 20th century Ukraine, we will encounter another child who found herself more comfortable with animals than with her own species. A little girl who, like Dina, was abandoned by the people who should have protected her, and who found an unlikely family among creatures covered in fur. The year was 1983, and the Soviet Union was still a global superpower, though cracks were beginning to show in the facade. In the village of Nova Blagoveshenka in southern Ukraine, a little girl named Oxana Oleksandrivna Malaya was born on November 4th. Her parents, already struggling with alcoholism and poverty, saw her birth not as a blessing, but as another burden, another mouth to feed in a household that could barely manage the children they already had. Oksana's early years were marked by neglect so severe it bordered on abandonment, even though she technically still lived with her parents. Her mother and father spent their days drinking, their evenings drinking more, and their nights in alcoholic stupors that left them oblivious to the needs of their children. Oksana later recalled that her mother told her there were simply too many kids and not enough beds, as if this explained and excused the treatment she received. From an early age, Oksana learned that she could not depend on her parents for food, for warmth, for comfort, or for safety. She was on her own in all the ways that mattered, even though she was just a toddler. The night that changed Oksana's life forever came when she was just 3 years old. The details remain somewhat unclear, as Oksana's memories of this period are understandably fragmented. But the essence of what happened is this. Her parents, drunk as usual, locked her outside. Whether this was a deliberate act of cruelty or merely the thoughtless action of people too intoxicated to care is unclear. Perhaps they were angry with her for some perceived misbehavior. Perhaps they simply forgot she existed. Whatever the reason, 3-year-old Oksana found herself alone in the cold Ukrainian night with no way to get back inside. The temperature was dropping, and Oksana was desperate for warmth. Driven by the pure survival instinct that exists in all young creatures, she did the only thing she could think of. Near the house was a crude kennel where the family kept their dog, a female they called Nida. Oksana crawled into the kennel, seeking the warmth of Nida's body. The dog, instead of rejecting this human intruder, allowed the little girl to curl up beside her, and there Oksana stayed. Her parents never came looking for her. Not that night, not the next day, not ever. It is difficult to fathom the depths of neglect this represents. Any parent in their right mind would have noticed a missing 3-year-old within hours at most. They would have torn the house and surrounding area apart looking for her. But Oksana's parents were not in their right minds, and they apparently did not notice or did not care that their daughter was no longer in the house. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and then years, and Oksana remained in the kennel with Nida and the other stray dogs that had made their home in and around the family's property. At first, Oksana was still fundamentally human. She spoke Ukrainian. She walked on 2 legs. She understood that she was different from the dogs, even if she was living among them. But slowly, inexorably, she began to change. The dogs became her family, her teachers, her entire social world, and like any young child learning from those around her, she began to imitate them. She watched how they communicated and started copying their barks and growls. She observed how they moved and began dropping to all fours to travel with the pack. She saw how they ate and started using the same techniques, lapping up water with her tongue and tearing at food with her teeth. The transformation was not instantaneous, but over the course of 5 years, Oxana Malaya effectively became more dog than human. She learned to bark, not the way a human might imitate a dog for fun, but truly bark, with the same pitches and cadences that the dogs use to communicate with each other. She learned the subtle body language of canine communication, the different postures that indicated aggression or submission or playfulness. She learned to trust her sense of smell, using it to identify friend from foe and to locate food. She developed calluses on her knees and palms from walking on all fours. Most tragically, she began to lose her grasp on human language. The Ukrainian word she had known faded from her mind, replaced by barks and growls and whimpers. But while Oxana was losing her humanity, she was gaining something else, a family that cared for her. The dogs accepted her as one of their own. They shared food with her. They slept curled up around her on cold nights, their body heat keeping her alive through brutal Ukrainian winters. They played with her during the day. And most importantly, they protected her. The pack became fiercely loyal to their strange, hairless pack member, willing to defend her against any threat. For the first time in her life, Oxana had a family that actually functioned as a family, even if that family happened to be composed of stray dogs. For 5 years, this was Oksana's life. She lived in and around the kennel, hunting with the dogs when they scavenged for food, playing when they played, sleeping when they slept. Her biological parents were still in the house nearby, but they might as well have been in another world. They never checked on her, never called her inside, never acknowledged that they had a daughter living among animals just meters away from them. The neighbors knew something strange was going on, but in the Soviet Union of the late 80s, people had learned to mind their own business. If a family wanted to let their child live with dogs, well, that was their business, however disturbing it might be. But in 1991, when Oksana was 8 years old, someone finally decided they could no longer turn a blind eye. A neighbor, disturbed by what they had observed, contacted the authorities and reported that there was a child living with dogs near their home. When social workers and police arrived at the property, they were greeted by a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. There was indeed a child living with the dogs, a young girl who appeared to be about 8, though her exact age was difficult to determine. And she was acting exactly like a dog. When the authorities tried to approach Oksana, the pack of dogs defended her aggressively, barking and snarling and making it clear they would attack if the humans came any closer. Oksana herself showed no sign of recognizing that these people were trying to help her. Instead, she reacted with fear and aggression, barking alongside the dogs, baring her teeth, making it clear she considered herself part of the pack. The authorities were forced to use food to lure the dogs away, creating an opening for them to grab Oksana and pull her away from her canine family. The girl fought and howled, making sounds that were not quite human, not quite dog, but something in between. When they managed to get Oksana away from the dogs and began to examine her, the full extent of her condition became clear. She could not speak, or at least could produce only a few garbled sounds that might once have been Ukrainian words, but were now so distorted as to be unintelligible. She walked on all fours with ease, but struggled to stay upright on 2 legs. She barked and growled to communicate. She shook her head vigorously when wet, exactly the way a dog shakes off water. She had a powerful sense of smell and would sniff everything, including people, before interacting with it. Her behavior was so canine that some of the first responders initially had trouble believing she was even human, despite her appearance. Oxana was taken to a children's home, and from there to a specialized facility for mentally disabled children in Barabol, in the Odessa Oblast region. The staff there had the daunting task of trying to rehabilitate a child who had missed 5 of the most critical years of human development. Those years, from ages 3 to 8, are when children normally master language, learn social skills, develop their personality and cognitive abilities, and form their understanding of the world. Oxana had spent those years learning to be a dog. The rehabilitation process was long and difficult. Speech therapists worked with Oxana for years, trying to teach her to speak human language again. It was an uphill battle. Young children have an extraordinary capacity for language learning, but there appears to be a critical window that closes around puberty. Oxana was right at the edge of that window when she was found. Some experts feared she had already missed her chance and would never be able to truly speak again. But slowly, painstakingly, Oxana began to relearn her native tongue. She would never speak with the fluency and natural intonation of someone who learned language normally, but she did learn to communicate verbally, to hold simple conversations, to express her needs and wants in words rather than barks. Other aspects of human behavior proved equally challenging. Oxana had to be taught to walk upright consistently, to wear clothes properly, to use utensils, to use a bathroom. She had to learn social rules and norms that most children absorb naturally through interaction with adults and other children. She had to learn to control impulses that would be normal for a dog, but were unacceptable for a human, like hiding food for later, or aggressive displays when threatened. And perhaps most difficult of all, she had to learn to think of herself as human, to see her reflection in the mirror and understand that the person looking back was her, not just another strange creature. But Oxana demonstrated a remarkable resilience and capacity for learning that surprised many of the experts who worked with her. While she would never fully catch up to her peers, never develop all the cognitive and social abilities she would have had if she had grown up normally, she made far more progress than most feral children do. By her late teens, she could speak in complete sentences, though her voice remained somewhat flat and monotone, lacking the natural rhythm and inflection of normal speech. She could read at a basic level. She could follow complex instructions. She could control her behavior well enough to function in a structured environment. Child psychologist Lynn Fry, who visited Oxana as part of a documentary project, was surprised by her level of cognitive development. When given intelligence tests, Oxana performed at about the level of a 6-year-old, which was far better than expected given her history. She could understand prepositions and other abstract concepts. She could recognize herself in a mirror, something that many feral children struggle with. She could draw pictures, though her skill level was that of a much younger child. Most remarkably, she retained the ability to bark exactly like a dog, a sound that people who heard it described as genuinely canine rather than a human imitation. Though she learned not to bark in public because it disturbed people, those who knew her well suspected she still barked when she was alone, a last remnant of the 5 years she spent as part of a dog pack. As Oxana entered adulthood, she faced the challenge of finding her place in a world that would never fully understand what she had been through. She was placed in a facility for adults with developmental disabilities, where she worked on a farm caring for animals. Perhaps it was fitting that she found comfort and purpose in working with livestock and farm dogs, creatures who did not judge her for her unusual past, and with whom she had a natural rapport that she never quite developed with most humans. In interviews given in her 30s, Oxana expressed a desire to be treated as a normal person, to be seen as more than just the dog girl, the label that the media had attached to her and that she could never quite escape. She also expressed a longing for her family, but not the parents who had neglected her so cruelly. She wanted to see her siblings, to reconnect with the biological family that had been scattered by the system. And most poignantly, she expressed a desire to find her biological mother, to understand why she had been cast out, to perhaps find some kind of closure or understanding. Whether she ever achieved these desires, whether she found any kind of peace with her past, is difficult to say. What is clear is that Oxana Malaya's story is one of both tragedy and triumph, of childhood stolen and humanity partially reclaimed, of the terrible cost of neglect, and the surprising capacity of human beings to survive and adapt, even in the most extreme circumstances. Her case became one of the most studied examples of a feral child in modern times, providing valuable insights into child development, the nature versus nurture debate, and the long-term effects of extreme neglect. It also raised uncomfortable questions about societal responsibility and the systems meant to protect children. How had Oxana been able to live among dogs for 5 years without anyone intervening sooner? What does it say about a community that such extreme neglect could go unaddressed for so long? And how many other children might be suffering similar fates, hidden from view, falling through the cracks of systems meant to protect them? But as haunting as Oxana's story is, it is not the only one from the late 20th century. Halfway around the world, in the mountains of Colombia, another child was experiencing something equally extraordinary, though her case would not come to light for many years. The year was 1954, though the exact date is lost to history. In a small village in the mountains of Colombia, a little girl, probably around 4 or 5 years old, was playing near her home when strangers appeared. What happened next is unclear, as the girl herself has no clear memory of the events. She remembers being carried on a man's back, remembers the fear and confusion, remembers being drugged with something that made her drowsy and disoriented. Then she remembers waking up in a jungle, completely alone, the men who had taken her nowhere to be seen. The little girl had been kidnapped, though the reason remains a mystery to this day. Perhaps the kidnappers had planned to ransom her, but got cold feet. Perhaps they were trafficking children, and she was too much trouble. Perhaps they simply panicked and abandoned her. Whatever their reasoning, they left a small child alone in the Colombian jungle, one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, and drove away. It should have been a death sentence. The jungle was filled with predators, with poisonous insects and snakes, with disease and 100 other hazards that could kill a grown man, let alone a frightened little girl. The girl, who would later be known as Marina Chapman, though that was not her birth name, a name she could no longer remember, spent her first days in the jungle in a state of near total terror. She wandered through the dense undergrowth, crying, calling out for help that never came, growing weaker from hunger and thirst. She tried to eat leaves and roots, but she didn't know which were safe and which were poisonous. She grew desperately ill, her body racked with pain from malnutrition and possibly food poisoning. She collapsed in the undergrowth, too weak to go on, waiting for death to take her. But death did not come. Instead, she was found by a troop of capuchin monkeys. These small, intelligent primates are known for their curiosity and their relatively peaceful nature compared to other monkey species. And for reasons that may never be fully understood, they decided to investigate this strange, hairless creature that had collapsed in their territory. At first, they kept their distance, watching her from the trees, chattering among themselves. But as hours passed and the girl did not move, did not threaten them, they grew bolder. One of the monkeys, an older female that Marina would later call Grandpa due to some confusion about gender, approached the girl and began to investigate her more closely. When the girl did not react aggressively, the monkey began to touch her, to examine her, to try to understand what this creature was. And then, in an act of compassion that defies easy explanation, the monkey brought food to the girl. Simple things at first, fruits and nuts that the girl could eat without preparation. The girl was so weak and so desperate that she ate whatever was offered, and slowly, very slowly, she began to recover. Over the following days and weeks, the troop of capuchin monkeys effectively adopted this strange, hairless young one. They included her in their daily foraging, showing her which plants were safe to eat and which should be avoided. They taught her how to climb trees, how to move through the canopy, how to find water. They communicated with her through gestures and sounds, and she learned to understand and respond. Most remarkably, they protected her. When predators approached, the monkeys would sound alarm calls and scramble to safety, and they made sure the girl came with them. They accepted her as one of their own, this small human child who had been abandoned by her own species. Marina would live with the capuchin monkeys for what she estimates was about 5 years, though time becomes difficult to measure when you are living entirely in the present, without calendars or schedules or any of the markers that humans use to organize time. During those years, she became more monkey than human in many ways. She learned to communicate with them through their vocalizations and body language. She learned to move through the trees with confidence, to judge distances and make leaps that would terrify most humans. She ate what they ate, primarily fruits, nuts, seeds, and the occasional insect. She learned to be constantly vigilant, to listen for the sounds of danger, to flee when the monkeys fled. But she never entirely forgot that she was human. There were moments when she would find something that sparked a dim memory, a tool left behind by humans, a sound in the distance that reminded her of voices. She would find reflective surfaces, pools of water or pieces of glass, and she would stare at her reflection, confused because while the monkeys looked at their reflections and seemed to recognize themselves, she looked different. She didn't have their fur, their tails, their distinctive faces. She looked like something else, but she couldn't remember what. The memories of her human childhood faded, becoming dreamlike and uncertain, until she wasn't entirely sure what she was or where she had come from. During her time with the monkeys, Marina had several close calls with death. She nearly drowned once when an older monkey, perhaps trying to help her in some way she didn't understand, pushed her into water. She described this monkey as Grandpa, and while experts later suggested the monkey may have actually been trying to drown her, seeing her as a threat or competition, Marina maintained that the monkey was trying to help, to show her something. She fell from trees more than once, though she never suffered serious injury. Her small size and the relatively short distances involved in the lower levels of the canopy, where she usually stayed protecting her from the worst harm. She encountered predators, including large snakes and big cats, and survived through a combination of luck and the protection of the monkey troop. But eventually, as Marina grew older and larger, her presence in the troop became more complicated. The dynamics of primate social groups are complex, and a growing human child represents an ambiguous figure, neither fully part of the group nor entirely an outsider. At some point, when Marina was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, she wandered or was led away from the monkey's primary territory. That's when she encountered other humans for the first time in years, a pair of hunters tracking game through the jungle. The hunters were shocked to discover a wild-looking girl, filthy and nearly naked, her hair long and matted, her body covered in scratches and scars. She moved like an animal, reacted to them with fear and aggression, and could not speak any language they recognized. She made sounds, vocalizations that seemed to have structure and meaning, but they were not Spanish or any indigenous language the hunters knew. They realized eventually that she was making monkey sounds, communicating in the only language she remembered. The hunters captured Marina and brought her back to civilization. But what should have been a rescue was in many ways just the beginning of another nightmare. Because Marina, now around 10 years old and with no memory of her birth family or even her real name, was about to discover that humans could be far crueler than any animal she had encountered in the jungle. The hunters sold her, trading her for a parrot to a woman in the town of Cucuta, who in turn sold her to a brothel. A 10-year-old girl who could barely walk upright, who could not speak Spanish, who did not understand even basic human customs, was sold into sexual slavery. The details of Marina's time in the brothel are mercifully sparse, as she has understandably chosen not to elaborate on this period. What is clear is that she was too feral, too strange to be useful to the brothel owners. She could not be controlled, could not understand or follow instructions, and frightened the customers with her wild behavior and monkey-like sounds. Eventually, whether she escaped or was simply thrown out as worthless, Marina ended up on the streets of Cucuta, homeless and alone once again. For several years, Marina lived as a street child, part of the large population of homeless youth that plagued Colombian cities. It was during this time that she began to slowly, painfully relearn how to be human. Other street children taught her words, made her repeat them until she could form basic sentences in Spanish. They taught her how to beg effectively, how to open doors, how to navigate the urban environment. She watched people constantly, copying their behaviors and mannerisms, trying to understand the rules of this strange human world. She had learned to survive in the jungle by imitating monkeys. Now she learned to survive in the city by imitating humans. Her time on the streets was brutal. She was subjected to abuse, exploitation, and deprivation that in some ways was worse than anything she had experienced in the jungle. She eventually became a slave to a mafia family, essentially their property, forced to work for them with no hope of escape. But Marina survived, as she had always survived, through a combination of adaptability, intelligence, and sheer stubborn will to live. Her salvation came in the form of a neighbor named Maruja, an older woman who saw the terrible conditions Marina was living in and decided to intervene. Maruja helped Marina escape from the mafia family, and made arrangements to send her to Bogota, Colombia's capital, to live with one of Maruja's daughters. When Marina was approximately 14 years old, this daughter, Maria, legally adopted her, giving her a stable home for the first time since her kidnapping a decade earlier. With Maria's family, Marina finally had the chance to recover and rebuild her life. She learned to read and write, though this proved extraordinarily difficult for someone who had missed so much early education. She learned social skills, how to interact with people, how to follow the rules and norms of civilized society. And slowly, she began to remember fragments of her early childhood before the kidnapping, though these memories remained frustratingly vague and incomplete. She could not remember her real name, could not remember where exactly she had come from, could not remember her biological family. That entire part of her life was simply gone, erased by trauma and time. In her late teens, Marina's adoptive family sent her to England to work as a nanny for another branch of the family that had relocated there, to the industrial city of Bradford in Yorkshire. It was in England that Marina would build her adult life. She met and married a man named John Chapman, a scientist and musician. Together they had 2 daughters and settled in Bradford, where Marina became, by all outward appearances, a perfectly normal, middle-aged British woman. But Marina never forgot her years in the Colombian jungle. She told her daughters stories about living with monkeys, stories they initially thought were fanciful tales or exaggerations. As her daughters grew older, one of them, Vanessa, began to realize that her mother's stories might actually be true. She encouraged Marina to write down her experiences, to create a record of this extraordinary chapter of her life. The result was a book published in 2013 titled The Girl with No Name: The Incredible True Story of a Child Raised by Monkeys. The book's publication sparked immediate controversy. Many people, including some publishers who initially rejected the manuscript, believed Marina's story was too incredible to be true. How could a 4 or 5-year-old child survive alone in the Colombian jungle? How could monkeys have accepted and nurtured a human child? Why couldn't Marina remember more details about her early life or her kidnapping? The story seemed to stretch credibility, to sound more like a fairy tale or a hoax than a factual account. Marina and her family responded to these doubts by subjecting themselves to extensive testing and investigation. Medical examinations of Marina's leg bones revealed Harris lines, distinctive marks that indicate severe malnutrition during childhood, consistent with her story of limited diet while living with the monkeys. Blood tests found evidence of unusual parasites and diseases that suggested extended exposure to jungle environments. A professor named Carlos Conde conducted psychological tests using photographs, showing Marina images of her adoptive family mixed with images of capuchin monkeys and measuring her emotional and physiological responses. The results suggested she was telling the truth about her experiences. National Geographic produced a documentary about Marina's story, Woman Raised by Monkeys, which aired in 2013. The program examined her claims, consulted with primatologists and psychologists, and ultimately concluded that while some details of her story might be embellished or misremembered, the core narrative was plausible and likely true. Capuchin monkeys are known to be unusually tolerant and even nurturing toward other species in some circumstances. A young human child, small and relatively helpless, might indeed have been accepted by a troop, especially if she was non-threatening and submissive. But doubts persist to this day. Anthropologist Catherine McKinnon has pointed out several aspects of Marina's story that seem unlikely or impossible based on our understanding of primate behavior and human physiology. Could a 5-year-old really survive in the jungle long enough to be found by monkeys? Would monkeys really have shared food with her rather than viewing her as competition? Marina herself acknowledges that the subtitle of her book, Raised by Monkeys, is somewhat misleading. The monkeys did not actively raise her in the way a mother raises a child. Rather, they tolerated her presence, and she survived by watching and copying them. It was a more passive relationship than the word raised implies. The truth of Marina Chapman's story may never be fully established. She has no documentation from her early childhood, no birth certificate, no missing person report, no family searching for her. Her memories of that time are fragmentary and possibly distorted by trauma, time, and the retelling of the story over many years. Some elements of her account may be embellished or simply wrong, but what is undeniable is that something extraordinary happened to this woman in her early childhood, something that left lasting effects on her psychology and physiology, something that involved extended time in a jungle environment and possibly significant interaction with primates. Marina's story, true or embellished, speaks to something deep in the human psyche, our fascination with the boundaries between human and animal, our anxiety about what makes us truly human, and our romantic notion that there is something pure and uncorrupted about nature. It also highlights the terrible vulnerability of children and the profound impact that early experiences have on human development. Whether Marina spent 5 years with monkeys or 5 months, whether every detail of her story is accurate or some parts are mistaken, the essential truth remains. She was a child who was abandoned, who survived against incredible odds, who lost years of her life to trauma and deprivation, and who somehow found the strength to rebuild and create a meaningful life for herself. And her story is far from unique. As we turn our attention to the African continent and to more recent times, we will encounter other children whose encounters with primates shaped their young lives in profound and tragic ways. In the year 1988, in a small village in Uganda, a little boy named John Ssebunya was 3 years old and living through a nightmare that no child should ever have to experience. Uganda was a country still scarred by years of civil war and political violence. The Ugandan Bush War had officially ended just 2 years earlier, but the countryside remained dangerous and unstable. In this context of upheaval and uncertainty, terrible things could happen to families, and one of the most terrible happened to John's. John's father was a violent man, made worse by alcohol. His mother tried to protect her children, tried to keep the family together despite her husband's abuse. But one day, the situation escalated beyond anything that had come before. John's father, in a fit of rage, murdered John's mother. The little boy witnessed the killing, saw his father kill the woman who had given him life and cared for him. The trauma was immediate and overwhelming. In the chaos and terror that followed, John did the only thing his young mind could conceive of. He ran. He fled from the house, from his father, from the scene of unimaginable horror. He ran into the nearby jungle, deep into the dense vegetation where he hoped his father could not follow. And there, traumatized and alone, unable to comprehend what had happened or what to do next, John simply kept running, kept moving deeper into the wilderness, as if he could run away from the memory of what he had seen. For several days, John wandered alone in the jungle. He was hungry, thirsty, terrified. He was only 3 years old, far too young to survive on his own. But he did have one advantage. He was in an area populated by vervet monkeys, small primates that live in social groups and are known for their intelligence and adaptability. And these monkeys, for reasons that can only be guessed at, decided to help the small, frightened human child they discovered in their territory. The monkeys approached John cautiously at first, curious about this strange creature that had appeared among them. John, in his traumatized state, did not run from them or try to hurt them. He was simply too exhausted, too overwhelmed to do anything but accept their presence. The monkeys seemed to recognize that this was a young one, helpless and in need. They began to offer him food, simple things like nuts and sweet potatoes that they had gathered. John ate what they gave him, his survival instinct overriding any hesitation. Over the days and weeks that followed, the vervet monkeys effectively adopted John into their troop. They showed him where to find food, what was safe to eat, and what should be avoided. They taught him how to climb trees, an essential skill for survival in their environment. They included him in their daily activities, their foraging and playing and socializing, and they protected him. Vervet monkeys have excellent eyesight and hearing. They post sentries to watch for predators and give alarm calls when danger approaches. Those warnings kept John safe from the many threats that lurked in the Ugandan jungle, from big cats to snakes to other dangers. John spent approximately 2 to 3 years with the vervet monkeys, from around age 3 to around age 5 or 6. During this time, he adapted to their way of life. He learned to move on all fours, finding it easier and faster than walking upright, especially when traveling with the monkeys through the underbrush. He learned their vocalizations, the different calls they use to communicate danger, food sources, social interactions. He learned to think like a monkey, to see the world from their perspective. His hair grew long and tangled, covering his face and body. His skin darkened from constant sun exposure. His fingernails grew long and strong from climbing. He developed the calluses and physical adaptations that came from a life spent outdoors, living more animal than human. But unlike some feral children, John had one significant advantage. He had already learned to speak before fleeing into the jungle. He had spent his first 3 years in human society, learning language, absorbing social norms, developing typically. This early human socialization, brief as it was, would prove crucial to his eventual recovery. John's time with the monkeys came to an end in 1991 when he was discovered by a local woman named Millie Seba. Millie was passing through the area when she spotted something unusual, a human child living and traveling with a troop of vervet monkeys. She immediately contacted local authorities, and a rescue operation was organized. But rescuing John proved far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The vervet monkeys had bonded with him. They saw him as part of their troop, and they were not about to let him be taken away without a fight. When rescuers approached, the monkeys reacted aggressively, throwing sticks and branches, making loud alarm calls, forming a protective circle around John. And John himself did not want to be rescued. He screamed and fought, making monkey-like sounds, trying to escape back to the only family he remembered. He had spent most of his young life with the monkeys and had no clear memory of human society or why he should want to return to it. Eventually, through a combination of patience and strategic use of food to distract the monkeys, the rescuers managed to get John away from the troop. But when they finally got a good look at him, they were shocked by his condition. John was covered in hair, so much that he looked almost animal-like. His body was filthy, caked with dirt, and God knows what else. He had severe calluses on his knees and palms from walking on all fours. Most alarmingly, when they examined him more closely and eventually cleaned him up, they discovered he was infested with intestinal parasites, including tapeworms that were over half a meter long. His diet of raw jungle food had left him severely malnourished and diseased. John was taken to an orphanage where the long process of rehabilitation began. Unlike many feral children, John showed remarkable capacity for recovery. His early years of human socialization had given him a foundation that could be rebuilt. He still had some grasp of language, even if it was buried under years of disuse. And he was still young enough that his brain retained significant plasticity, the ability to learn and adapt. But the recovery process was far from easy. John had to relearn how to walk upright consistently, to use it as his primary mode of movement rather than dropping to all fours when tired or stressed. He had to learn or relearn how to use a toilet, to wear clothes properly, to eat with utensils, to sleep in a bed. All the basic aspects of human life that most children learn without conscious effort, but which John had forgotten or never fully mastered. He had to be taught to control behaviors that would be normal for a monkey, but were inappropriate for a human, like aggressive displays, food hoarding, or climbing on furniture and other people. Perhaps most challenging was the social and emotional rehabilitation. John had witnessed his mother's murder and then spent years living in traumatic conditions. He had emotional scars that went far deeper than his physical ailments. He needed therapy, patience, and understanding, all things that were in short supply in an underfunded Ugandan orphanage dealing with hundreds of children traumatized by years of civil war. But John had something else going for him. He had a foster father named Paul Waswa, who took him in and cared for him with genuine compassion. Waswa provided the stability and affection that John desperately needed. And slowly, with support and care, John began to recover. He learned to speak again, this time more fluently than before. He learned to read and write. He learned social skills and how to interact with other children. He discovered that he had a gift, a beautiful singing voice that brought him joy and gave him a way to express emotions he couldn't put into words. In 1999, John was invited to join the Pearl of Africa Children's Choir, a Ugandan musical group that toured internationally, performing and sharing their message of hope and resilience. John traveled the world with the choir, visiting countries he had never imagined existed, sharing his story with audiences who were moved by his survival and recovery. He became something of a celebrity, a symbol of the human capacity to overcome even the most extreme trauma and deprivation. Scientists and psychologists took great interest in John's case. Unlike many feral children, he was able to communicate clearly about his experiences. He could describe what it was like to live with the monkeys, how they communicated, how they behaved toward him. He could talk about the trauma that had driven him into the jungle in the first place. This made him an invaluable source of information about feral children and about the effects of extreme early trauma on child development. What made John's case particularly fascinating to researchers was that he had experienced significant human socialization before becoming feral, then spent years in a non-human environment, and then successfully reintegrated into human society. This allowed them to study how early socialization can be maintained even through years of disuse, how critical periods in development work, and what factors contribute to successful rehabilitation. John's story also highlighted the remarkable capacity of some animal species to show compassion and care toward vulnerable individuals of other species. Vervet monkeys are highly social animals with complex group dynamics. The fact that they accepted John, protected him, and taught him how to survive in their environment speaks to a capacity for empathy and care that challenges simplistic views of animal behavior as purely instinctual and self-serving. Today, John Ssebunya is an adult living in Uganda. He has overcome extraordinary odds to build a meaningful life for himself. He has even competed in the Special Olympics, representing his country with pride. His story is one of the most positive outcomes of any feral child case, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of early intervention and support. But John's success should not obscure the tragedy that underlies his story. He should never have had to witness his mother's death. He should never have had to flee into the jungle to survive. He should never have had to spend his early childhood living with monkeys because human society had failed to protect him. His recovery is remarkable, but the trauma he endured has left scars that will never fully heal. And his case raises disturbing questions about how many other children might be suffering in similar ways, hidden from view, falling through the cracks of systems meant to protect them. As we move from the jungles of Uganda to the urban sprawl of post-Soviet Russia, we will encounter another child who found that animals could provide the care and protection that humans should have offered, but failed to deliver. The year was 1996, and Russia was in chaos. The Soviet Union had collapsed 5 years earlier, and the transition to a market economy had been catastrophic for millions of ordinary Russians. State industries were being sold off for pennies on the dollar to well-connected oligarchs. Pensions and wages went unpaid for months. The social safety net that had existed under communism, flawed as it was, had been dismantled without anything adequate taking its place. Families were disintegrating under the economic pressure. And nowhere was this crisis more visible than in the rising number of street children, homeless youth abandoned or fleeing from dysfunctional families, trying to survive in the brutal urban environment. In the city of Roitov, a suburb just west of Moscow, a little boy named Ivan Mishukov was living through his own personal nightmare. He had been born in 1992 during the worst of the economic collapse. His father was absent from his life. His mother had a boyfriend who was an alcoholic and likely abusive. The home environment was chaotic and dangerous, and little Ivan, just 4 years old, felt profoundly unsafe and unloved. He was neglected, often left alone for days while his mother and her boyfriend drank themselves into stupors, apparently forgetting they had a child who needed to be fed and cared for. One day, Ivan made a decision that would seem incomprehensible for such a young child, but which made perfect sense in his desperate circumstances. He left. He simply walked out of the apartment and decided he would rather take his chances on the streets than endure another day in the home that should have been his refuge but had become his prison. He was 4 years old, and he had decided that he would be better off homeless than living with the people who were supposed to care for him. Ivan's first days on the streets were terrifying. He was hungry, cold, and utterly alone in a city that had no time or resources to care about one more abandoned child. Moscow in the mid-90s was a harsh place for anyone, but for a 4-year-old child with no resources and no one to turn to, it should have been a death sentence. But Ivan had one advantage he didn't know he had. He was an animal lover, and he was about to encounter other creatures who were also struggling to survive in the post-Soviet urban jungle. Stray dogs were everywhere in Russian cities during this period. As the economy collapsed and people could no longer afford to feed pets, many animals were simply turned out onto the streets. These dogs formed packs, roaming the city in search of food, finding shelter wherever they could, creating a parallel society of canine outcasts that mirrored the human tragedy unfolding around them. And Ivan, desperate and alone, encountered one of these packs. The dogs were wary of humans. They had learned through painful experience that people could be dangerous, could kick them or throw stones or chase them away. But this child was different. He was small, non-threatening, and most importantly, he began to share food with them. Ivan survived by begging on the streets, approaching people and asking for money or food. Some people, moved by the sight of such a young child, alone and in need, would give him scraps, money, leftovers from their meals. And Ivan, in an act of generosity that probably saved his life, would share whatever he received with the stray dogs he had encountered. At first, the dogs simply accepted the food and kept their distance. But as days turned into weeks and Ivan kept sharing, kept showing that he was not a threat, the dogs began to trust him. They allowed him to come closer. They stopped growling when he approached, and eventually they let him join them. When night fell and temperatures dropped, often reaching -30°C during the brutal Moscow winters, the dogs would curl up together in whatever sheltered spot they had found, an old building, a basement, an alcove that blocked the wind. And they let Ivan curl up with them, his small body pressed against their warm fur, their combined body heat keeping him alive through the night. Over the course of about 2 years, Ivan Mishukov did not just live with these dogs. He became one of them. He learned their social structures, their hierarchies, their communication. He understood when they were warning him of danger, when they were hungry, when they were content. And remarkably, the pack accepted him not just as a tolerated presence, but as a member, and eventually, according to some accounts, even as their leader. The concept of a human child becoming pack leader to a group of stray dogs sounds like something from fiction, but multiple sources report this detail. Dogs have complex social hierarchies, and it's possible that Ivan, as the one who could beg for food from humans, a resource the dogs could not access on their own, gained a position of special status within the pack. Ivan survived this way for approximately 2 years. During the day, he would beg for food, which he would share with his canine family. At night, they would protect him, keeping him warm and safe from human predators who might harm a vulnerable child. They formed a tight unit, a family of outcasts who had found each other in the chaos of post-Soviet Russia. And Ivan, who had found only neglect and abuse in his human home, found something precious with the dogs. He found loyalty, protection, and in their own way, love. But Ivan's story reached the ears of the police, stories of a wild child living with dogs on the streets. They attempted to rescue him several times, but each attempt failed. When police approached, the dogs would react aggressively, surrounding Ivan, growling and barking, making it clear they would attack anyone who tried to take him. And Ivan himself did not want to be rescued. He would flee with the dogs, disappearing into the urban maze they knew so well. This happened 3 times. The police would locate Ivan, would try to grab him, and he and his canine family would escape. Finally, in 1998, when Ivan was 6 years old, the police changed their tactics. Instead of trying to grab Ivan directly, they laid a trap. They left food in a restaurant kitchen, knowing that the smell would be irresistible to the starving pack. When the dogs entered to get the food, the police blocked the exits, and were able to separate Ivan from the pack long enough to remove him. Ivan, they reported, howled with anguish at being separated from his family, the dogs who had cared for him when no human would. Ivan was taken to a children's shelter in Roitov, and from there, his slow reintegration into human society began. Unlike many feral children, Ivan had significant advantages. He had only been with the dogs for 2 years, not 5 or 10. He had spent his first 4 years in human society, so he had a foundation of language and social understanding to build upon. And perhaps most importantly, he retained his language skills. He could still speak Russian. He had maintained this ability even while living with the dogs, perhaps because he still had to communicate with humans when begging for food, perhaps simply because 2 years was not long enough to fully erase what he had learned in his first years of life. This meant that Ivan's rehabilitation was faster and more successful than that of many feral children. He relearned how to function in human society relatively quickly. He went to school. He learned to control the behaviors he had developed while living with the dogs. He still had some dog-like tendencies. He would sniff food before eating. He sometimes had aggressive reactions when stressed. He preferred to hide things rather than leave them in the open, but these behaviors gradually diminished over time. Ivan's case was helped enormously by the fact that he was adopted by a loving foster mother named Tatiana Babanina. She provided the stable, nurturing home environment that Ivan had never had. She helped him overcome his trauma. She made sure he received a good education, and she never judged him for his unusual past. With her support, Ivan not only recovered, but thrived. He attended and graduated from Kronstadt Naval Cadet School, a prestigious military academy. He went on to serve in the Russian army. He found a full-time job in a factory. He gave interviews about his experiences, helping others understand the desperate circumstances that drive children to the streets. But the story has a bitter ending for Ivan's canine family. When Ivan was taken away, his pack of dogs came looking for him. They tracked him to the children's shelter and appeared at the gates, presumably trying to get to the human they had protected and cared for. The local authorities, viewing the dogs as a threat and a nuisance, made the decision to have them killed. Ivan's only family, the dogs who had kept him alive through 2 brutal Moscow winters, were destroyed. When Ivan learned what had happened, he was heartbroken. He later said, "I understand that if it wasn't for those dogs, I wouldn't have survived on the street. But I am also grateful to the policemen who took me from the pack, and of course, to my foster mother who raised me." But the loss of the dogs remained a source of grief, a reminder of all that he had sacrificed in returning to human society. Ivan Mishukov's story has inspired numerous works of art and literature. Australian writer Eva Hornung wrote a novel called Dog Boy that was heavily based on his experiences. English playwright Hattie Naylor wrote a play called Ivan and the Dogs that won the Tinniswood Award for original radio drama and was nominated for an Olivier Award. A Welsh band called Nine Bach recorded a song about him called Ifan, sung in Welsh, that Ivan participated in by appearing in the music video and showing the locations where he had lived with his dog pack. These artistic works have helped keep Ivan's story alive, but they have also sometimes romanticized it, turning a tragedy into something more palatable and less disturbing. The reality of Ivan's story is that it is an indictment of a failed system and a society in crisis. A 4-year-old child should never have felt safer on the streets than in his own home. He should never have had to survive by begging and sharing food with stray dogs. The fact that he lived this way for 2 years, visible to everyone, begging on the streets, and no one intervened until police were specifically informed, speaks to a societal failure of staggering proportions. But Ivan's story is also one of hope and resilience. Unlike many feral children, he recovered fully. He built a successful life for himself. He is now a well-adjusted adult with a job, a place in society, and the ability to reflect on and share his experiences. His success demonstrates that with early intervention, proper support, and a loving home environment, even children who have experienced extreme trauma and deprivation can recover and thrive. As we have seen through these various cases, spanning centuries and continents, the phenomenon of feral children raises profound questions about human nature and development. What can we learn from these tragic stories? What do they tell us about what makes us human? The cases we have examined, Victor of Aveyron, Dina Sanichar, Oxana Malaya, Marina Chapman, John Ssebunya, and Ivan Mishukov, represent a tiny fraction of the estimated 100 or so documented cases of feral children throughout human history. But they are among the best documented and most carefully studied, and they provide us with crucial insights into human development, the nature versus nurture debate, and the long-term effects of extreme early deprivation. One of the most important lessons from these cases is the existence and importance of what psychologists call critical periods in human development. These are windows of time during which certain types of learning must occur, or they may become very difficult or impossible later in life. The most obvious critical period is for language acquisition. Children have an extraordinary capacity to learn language up until around the age of puberty, after which this ability begins to decline dramatically. Victor of Aveyron, discovered around age 12, was never able to learn to speak despite years of intensive instruction. Dina Sanichar, found around age 6 or 7, similarly never mastered language. In contrast, Ivan Mishukov, who maintained his language abilities during his time with the dogs and was rescued at age 6, recovered his language skills fully. John Ssebunya, who had learned to speak before becoming feral and was rescued at around age 5 or 6, also regained language. The pattern is clear. Miss the critical window for language learning, and full recovery may be impossible. But critical periods exist for other types of development as well. Social and emotional development, motor skills, sensory processing, all of these have optimal windows for learning. Children who miss these windows due to extreme deprivation or lack of human contact may never fully catch up, even with intensive intervention. This has profound implications for how we understand child development and how we respond to cases of neglect and abuse. These cases also provide evidence in the long-standing debate between nature and nurture, between what aspects of human behavior are innate and what must be learned. The feral children demonstrate conclusively that many things we take for granted as natural human behaviors are actually learned. Walking upright, using language, eating cooked food, wearing clothes, following social norms, all of these require learning and socialization. A human child raised without human contact does not automatically develop these behaviors. Instead, they adapt to their environment, learning from whatever models are available, whether those models are wolves, monkeys, or dogs. At the same time, these cases show that some aspects of humanity appear to be innate, or at least very deeply rooted. Even after years with animals, feral children retain their human form, their human cognitive potential, their capacity for learning and change. They are not simply animals, even if they have learned to act like them. There is something fundamentally human that persists, something that can be drawn out and developed if the right support and intervention are provided early enough. The success or failure of rehabilitation in these cases appears to depend on several key factors. First, the age at which the child was discovered matters enormously. Children found before the critical periods have closed, generally before puberty, have a much better chance of recovery. Second, the length of time spent in the feral state is crucial. A child who lived with animals for a year or two, like Ivan Mishukov, has a much better prognosis than one who spent 5 years or more, like Oxana Malaya. Third, whether the child had any human socialization before becoming feral makes a huge difference. Children like Ssebunya, who had learned to speak and had experienced normal human interaction before their trauma, tend to recover better than those who were abandoned in infancy. Fourth, and perhaps most important, the quality of care and support provided after rescue is vital. Children who are placed in loving, stable homes with caregivers who have the patience and resources to help them recover, like Ivan Mishukov with his foster mother, or Ssebunya with his foster father, fare far better than those who end up in underfunded institutions with minimal individual attention. This underscores a crucial point. The damage done by feral experiences can potentially be healed, but only with significant investment of time, resources, and compassion. It is also important to note that many claimed cases of feral children have been revealed to be hoaxes or misunderstandings. The famous case of the wolf girls Amala and Kamala, discovered in India in 1920 by Reverend Jal Singh, was long held up as one of the best documented cases of feral children. But modern investigation by researchers like French surgeon Serge Arolis has revealed that the case was almost certainly a fraud, perpetrated by Singh to raise money for his orphanage. The girls were probably mentally disabled children whom Singh dressed up as feral children for publicity and profit. Similarly, many recent cases of supposed feral children have turned out to be children with autism or other developmental disabilities who were abandoned shortly before being found, not children who had genuinely spent years living in the wild. This means we must approach any claim of a feral child with healthy skepticism. The phenomenon is real, but it is also rare and often exaggerated or fabricated. Careful investigation, medical and psychological testing, and corroboration of details are essential before accepting any case as genuine. The cases we have examined in this video are among those that have withstood such scrutiny and appear to be, in their essentials, true accounts of children who lived for extended periods without normal human contact. What these cases ultimately reveal is something simultaneously hopeful and heartbreaking about human nature. They show us that we are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of surviving and even thriving in circumstances that seem impossible. A 4-year-old child can survive for years with stray dogs in Moscow. A 5-year-old girl can learn to live with capuchin monkeys in the Colombian jungle. This adaptability is part of what has made our species so successful, our ability to adjust to almost any environment, to learn from almost any available models. But these cases also show us just how vulnerable children are and how much they depend on adequate care during their early years. A child who misses critical periods of development may never fully recover, no matter how much intervention they receive later. The most sophisticated intelligence, the most remarkable human capacities, can be stunted or lost entirely if a child is not provided with appropriate care, nurturing, and socialization during those crucial early years. And perhaps most importantly, These cases raise uncomfortable questions about the societies in which these tragedies occur. How does a child end up living with animals for years without anyone noticing or intervening? What kind of society allows a 3-year-old to be locked outside to live with dogs? What circumstances drive a 4-year-old to decide that life on the streets with stray animals is preferable to home? These are not just individual tragedies, but societal failures, evidence of systems that are not adequately protecting their most vulnerable members. The stories of feral children are ultimately stories about the importance of connection, care, and compassion. They show us what can happen when these essential elements are missing from a child's life. But they also show us the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to survive and even to heal from experiences that should by all rights destroy a person. Children like Ivan Mishukov and Ssebunya, who have gone on to build meaningful lives for themselves despite their traumatic early years, stand as testaments to this resilience. In the end, the phenomenon of feral children forces us to confront fundamental questions about what it means to be human. Are we born human, or do we learn to be human? The answer, these cases suggest, is both. We are born with human bodies, human brains, human potential. But we only become fully human through our interactions with other humans, through language and culture and society. Take away those interactions during the critical early years, and we become something else, not quite animal, but no longer fully human either, something in between. These are the stories that history tries to forget, but which we must remember. They are uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability, human cruelty, and human capacity for both destruction and redemption. They are reminders that every child deserves to be protected, nurtured, and given the opportunity to develop their full human potential. And they are warnings about what can happen when we fail in that fundamental responsibility. If you found these stories as fascinating and moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Share it with others who might be interested in these incredible true stories. And most importantly, if you know of a child who is being neglected or abused, please speak up. Don't let another child slip through the cracks and become another tragic case in the long history of feral children. Every child deserves better. Every child deserves the chance to be fully human. Thank you for listening.